Hi guys, it's Khalid. I hope everybody is doing well. Tonight I'm talking about the Palestinians, or more broadly, the Palestinian political project. This is something that I've talked about before, touched upon in various ways before. Once in a video called Abolish Justice, my favorite little bit I ever did. And then another one called Palestinian Solidarity and the Perpetual Virtue Machine, probably my second favorite. I don't know if that's a coincidence, but we'll see how well or how much I like what I do here. Basically, these are just some thoughts that have been rattling around my brain for the past 6 months regarding the Palestinian political project and what happens to my understanding of that project when I look at it through through like a methodical, dispassionate, clinical lens, sort of the same lens that I've been using to take a look at primarily like contemporary American politics on the left. So, where to start? Well, I guess like a good place to start is to provide just a quick recap about like what I mean by the political model, the simple model of politics that I've been using. So if you haven't watched any of my other stuff, here's how I think about it. I think about a politics, good, bad, whatever, as containing three ingredients. One is a goal, is an objective. And for your politics to be good and useful, your objective has to be, your goal has to be clear, concrete, measurable, not like romantic, like not fanciful and utopian, lacking anything that you can put your finger on. You can't say, I want justice in the abstract. Right? If you want justice, you don't say, I want justice. Okay, you have to articulate exactly what that means in concrete terms, and pursue it and articulate that as your political goal. World peace, freedom, whatever it is. These are all nonsense vague terms, right, that we use as shortcuts. But the problem is that they're all subjective in nature, and we all have a tendency to believe that they're not subjective in nature. What I argue in the video called Abolish Justice is that if you think about your political project in terms of injustice terms, then you've sort of abandoned your ability to understand the realities of politics, which is a fight for power. Okay? A justice implies that there is a right and a wrong that can be resolved by some sort of authority. But the realities of politics is that none of those things exist, right? There's just interests and the power to either advance those interests or the lack of power to always fall short. And so justice is not like a good abstract goal or a good goal in general because of its subjectivity and vagueness. Okay, so moving on, what you need political practices that work. Okay, so you can't just say, I want something and just pray for it every single day. Praying, shaking your fist at the sky, all these things are not meaningful political practices. You have to have a coherent project whose details are, or whose functions can be claimed credibly or demonstrated to be advancing you towards your ultimate goal. Like I should be able to draw a line between where I am, what I'm doing, and through what I'm doing to where I want to get to. The analogy that I've always used for the general disconnect that people have associated with this goals versus methods problem is that like your methods should be taking you towards your destination and all the way to your destination. The analogy I've used was like you're trying to get to the moon, and you decide that the best method to get there is to build a hot air balloon. And there's an obvious problem with that to everybody, which is that even though the hot air balloon is headed in the right direction, right? It suggests that you're making progress towards your goal. There's a fundamental and obvious flaw in this approach, because it doesn't actually take into consideration the scale of your project. And just the laws of physics preclude your methods from actually being able to achieve what you're trying to achieve. So when somebody says, no, look at us, we're building these hot air balloons. Last time we went up 50 feet, this time we went up 100 feet, next time we're going to go up 150 feet. We're making progress. Okay, that person, because they refuse, refuse to acknowledge the problem of physics associated with their endeavor. What they're doing is they're basically taking resources away from an alternative method, an alternative approach. And maybe it's like taking resources away from thinking and contemplating about what a better approach, one that actually contends with the realities of physics, would entail, right? So it's not benign to just like do stuff that looks like making progress because it makes us feel good, right? I can't respect that project, because there are costs in the sense that if I know that something is failing and can't succeed, then the people that this project is supposed to help, I'm dooming them for a perpetuity of suffering. And all I'm doing for myself and even for them is giving them some sort of temporary emotional relief. Like, yes, we made progress. We got higher with our balloon. But if their survival depends on getting to the moon, then this is a problem. Okay? I'm going to get to the whole Palestinian thing eventually. Sorry for talking at length about this. Okay, and then finally, like, you have your ideology. You have the story. So you have your what, like the goal that you're trying to get to. You have your how, the methods. Okay, both of these need to be robust and correct. And then finally, you have your why, the story that you tell yourself, your ideological framework, your explanatory framework that tells you, hey, why are you where you are? What happened? What tidbits of history are you going to select and stitch together into a meaningful narrative that help you understand your position, the causes of your suffering, who your friends are and who your enemies are, and then, as it relates to your political project, what goals make sense to pursue? Okay, what goal makes sense to pursue? And then what methods are the right ones? Okay, so for example, and then finally, like each one of these, like if we think of these as like legs of a stool, these three things, they all have to be solid. Like you can't have a rotten leg where the wood's falling apart, but all of them sort of need to be connected with one another and reinforcing one another. So, like an ideological framework, a story that you tell yourself about the world, your commitment, right? And this is sort of like, you can think about it as like the political equivalent of a religion, something that you're absolutely committed to. If that interferes with your, or points you in the wrong goal, and a goal that doesn't actually benefit you, but somehow you're committed to it ideologically, okay, that's a problem. And also suggests that like the methods that are stupid, that actually don't get you to your goal, that's a problem. So like to extend our example, if like we want all these things to be interconnected, so we say like maybe your ideology is that humans are destroying the planet, and this is why we should move all of humanity to the moon, right? It's super important, super critical to do this, and this is why we need to find this solution. Okay, so now you've connected your ideology to your political goal. Okay, so those things seem to be coherent. Now, part of your ideology might be like, because I'm a hippie, naturalist, whatever, I believe it's evil to use any materials aside from cloth, wood, and like straw, whatever. So that ideological commitment essentially precludes success because it forces you to build hot air balloons as your only way forward to try and solve this problem. And what you end up doing, because you privilege, in a sense, your ideology over the success of your project, you end up trying to explain why the hot air balloon makes sense, despite the obviousness of its insanity. And this is how ideology interacts with all of us, right? And honestly, like for a successful political project, ideology needs to be that intense. Okay, the point of having an ideology within a political framework is to motivate people collectively to work towards a common goal. Honestly, like without question. If there are doubts amongst people, if the way that they understand their political project has like these chinks in the armor, right? Then like you won't get enough alignment and enough motivation, especially if the task is difficult, in order to move things forward. Like they are blinders that you put on yourself collectively as an interested group to focus all of your attention so you can run as hard as possible, as fast as possible. This, of course, is a double-edged sword in the sense that if somebody ends up, because of the methods or the goals or whatever it is, you end up on a track going in a circle, you'll never be able to realize it. The fact that you're not making progress is invisible to you because the only thing you can see is what's right in front of you. And the circular nature of the track, the fact that you've been idle for the past 70 years, not making meaningful progress towards your goal, is invisibilized. I don't think that's a word. Okay. So what does all of this have to do with the Palestinians? Well, if I look at the Palestinians, I'm going to go ahead and segment them into different groups. And this is, just the reality of their conditions. There are, 12, 13, 15 million Palestinians spread around the world in vastly different political and economic conditions. I live in the U.S. I have American citizenship, and I'm economically comfortable. The stressors, the day-to-day stressors, the incentives that motivate me are vastly different than those of somebody in the Gaza Strip, in a refugee camp in Lebanon, in the West Bank. And in all those three instances, and the reason that I brought them up is because despite the fact that they're also incredibly varied in nature, they share a common condition that's unique to those Palestinians as opposed to most others, which is the fact that they all inherently, at the point of their birth, lack political power in the state that they inhabit. Okay, so the state that controls everything in their life, that has ultimate authority over over the laws that they have to navigate, they can't influence it through innate formal political means. So if you're born as a refugee in Lebanon, and like right now you're like third generation in, right? Your parents were born and raised in Lebanon as refugees, and probably your grandparents were born and raised in Lebanon as refugees. Okay? And despite the fact that this is an intergenerational condition, 3 generations in, you're still going to be born, and for no reason except a strange political delineation, okay, you're going to be assigned the status of a non-citizen, somebody who has no political power anywhere. And there are consequences to that. In the case of refugees in Lebanon, you're excluded from a good part of the labor market. You can only work basically low-wage jobs. You have no access into the professional market. Actually, this is something that's being debated. It's been debated before. I don't know if this is going to be corrected. Any progress is going to be made on that front. And then there's systems of social isolation. There are these refugee camps that Palestinians live in, essentially slums. And basically, if you have no political or economic means to escape them, you're trapped within these situations of perpetual economic and social misery, where your kids have to go to separate schools than the Lebanese, despite the fact that you're just learning the same Arabic, English, French, whatever it is, same math and science, but you're socially isolated because you're an other. You have the wrong kind of documentation. Naturally, I think anybody objectively looking at this from the outside would see that as obvious cruelty and insanity. If the same thing happened here in the US and 3 generations of Guatemalans numbering in hundreds of thousands or millions, shall we say, are cursed to just perpetually live in camps and not be given any citizenship, we would identify that as being insane. And some people might say, well, we're preserving their right to return to Guatemala. But it's obviously a cruelty, an insane amount of suffering if that's not an option that's available to them. There's no excuse for them not to be naturalized in the state. All right. So what's going on with Palestinian refugees that has perpetuated this condition that I think is obviously cruel, and we all understand is obviously cruel? There are a compounding number of interests that benefit from the Palestinians not becoming naturalized as Lebanese citizens. One is the Lebanese ruling elite, a group of people who are committed or whose power they can only understand as being part of this sectarian system where different religious groups have varying positions, prescribed positions within government. And because of that, these little tribal leaders, these little scumbags, get to assert power over their own little religious groups, essentially denying the Lebanese people the ability to act collectively, okay, outside these sectarian constraints towards greater goals that benefit them. And this group of people is highly interested in excluding Palestinians from Lebanese citizenship because it undermines the current stability of the system, right? Or at least it historically that has been a great motivator. The other group of people who are deeply invested in the Palestinians not having Lebanese citizenship is the Palestinian Authority, and before that, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, right? Because for them, their claims to statism, their claims to authority rest upon the idea that they are the representatives of all Palestinian people, wherever they might be, right? The emergence of the PLO as a body with increasing power, okay, was built around the project of establishing itself as a political body in exile, right? Despite not having claims or control over a physical location, they opted for claiming, okay, asserting power over people. And you just name the groups and you say, these people belong to me, these people belong to me, these people belong to me. And for them, the Palestinian Authority, like even today, those refugees represent a card that they use in whatever meaningless negotiations, or they maybe think they're going to use in some meaningless negotiation with the Israeli Authority in order to get like a little bit more money, a little bit more power, whatever the fuck it is, right? Like nobody's under the delusion that the Palestinian Authority, this absurdly corrupt collection of octogenarian scumbags, is in any way interested in the well-being of anybody other than themselves. So those are the people who are like interested or politically motivated in maintaining the exclusion of the Palestinians from the political project of Lebanese citizenship. Okay, so here we start seeing the outlines of a political project as has been classically understood for, I don't know, quite a few decades by the Palestinians, which is the idea of the return of the refugee to their ancestral home. The right of return is sort of like a pillar of the Palestinian political project. And the ideology from, okay, so that's the goal. The ideology from which that goal emerges is also relatively simple to understand if you're familiar with this discourse, which is that Palestinians are an ethno-nationalist group. Okay, and what that means is that there's a geographic piece of land somewhere, in this case, the land drawn during the Sykes-Picot Agreement, this agreement between the British and the French after World War I, that this piece of land and its inhabitants ancestrally represent an ethno-nationalist group whose rights, whose claims, whose safety, all that stuff naturally emerges from their existence in these original towns and homes. Okay, and that's not a weird thing for anybody to believe. Like the template of ethno-nationalism is the thing that honestly dominates the current global consciousness. Most everybody falls within some form of ethno-nationalism, right? With like very few like exceptions. So yeah, it's not a weird thing to believe, but like that is built on like real stuff. Okay, so that ideology manages to explain certain things. The idea that, oh, when we are back in our homes, in our ancestral homes in Palestine, we had maybe lands, we had security, we had safety. We weren't living in these slum refugee camps with sewer water dripping on our heads. And, you know, like, there was no real political power at that point, but at least we didn't have less political power than anybody else, okay, than our neighbors, than whatever it might be, okay? So that's the ideology that sort of animates the idea of the right of return. You know, and fundamentally, it's like this is an unjust condition because of this ideology, these natural rights, these claims to land. It's unjust for that right to be taken away in any shape or form at any point in history. Okay, so that right is transmitted from father to son and mother to daughter in perpetuity. But unfortunately, what's also being transmitted in perpetuity, not as a function of this ideology, I just want to be clear, but what's also being transmitted is your status as a refugee, okay? And honestly, the ideology that Palestinians only have a home, can only have their rights when they return to Palestine, emerges from the need to explain the terrible conditions that they're in, right? Because what else explains it? Why won't these people, these Lebanese, these people who are our neighbors, we speak the same language, we participate in the economy, we use the same currency, like all this stuff that makes us indistinguishable from them ethnically, why won't they stop this immense cruelty of maintaining our refugee status? And it must be because we don't want it. Okay? Now, like there is somewhere in the middle, right? So, like the ideology supports this goal, and I'm saying that there are incentives that, like fucked up incentives, in my opinion, that support the goal as well. Okay, and I'm also making this additional claim that the goal produces the ideology, okay, or at least the goal. And also I would claim the interests that support the goal help reproduce and maintain this ideology. But let's look at the last factor, which is the how. Like, how do Palestinians in these Lebanese refugee camps, how do they advance this interest of theirs? Okay, how do they go about achieving this goal? Based on the ideology that they have. And this is where the entire political project breaks. These individuals, the people who are most interested in the transformation of their conditions, ending of their political isolation or the full political disenfranchisement, their economic exclusion, their social isolation, the people who are most motivated by that on a day-to-day basis don't have any political tools at their disposal to advance this particular goal, the goal of the right of return. Because their locus of control is Lebanon, right? The place where they participate socially, they can engage with other people, is with other Lebanese people who have power only over their own government and what their government can do. The place where they participate economically and they might be able to organize, labor strikes or whatever it might be, tools or acts of social disruption, protests, whatever have you, purely exist within Lebanon. The ability to align your interests, your material interests with other people or other Lebanese workers. Okay? And so your locus of control is there. And the thing is, you can do all the politics in the world, but because of where you're placed geographically and the extent of your reach politically, you can only ask the Lebanese government of things. Okay? And the Lebanese people actually fuck the Lebanese government, but the Lebanese people, they are your conduit of power. And they don't have the power to grant you the right of return. So what you're reduced to is a state of total surrender. You must, if your belief or if your political objective is to retain the right of return, okay, part of that political project is to surrender your politics, your political project, to another authority. Okay, this is the legacy of the PLO. Their centralization of power, their claim that they represent the interests of all Palestinians everywhere. That you, as a refugee, the person who's most impacted in that, have to pray to God that these other people elsewhere, other Palestinians, are so bound up by the Palestinian project. These, like me, like an American scumbag living here, going about my day, worrying about like absolute bullshit, right? Like I know all these Palestinians who live around me who's like $1 million homes, worried about whether to send their kids to like Yale or Columbia. Like those are the things that are most pressing. And every once in a while they take a break to go advocate for the Palestinian cause. But the definition of the Palestinian cause isn't tempered, isn't it doesn't have any pressure against it. Okay, the pressure of day-to-day, the crushing day-to-day realities of being a refugee. And so, this is the extent of your political tools, total impotence, and begging and hoping that these other people who haven't managed to do fucking anything, they haven't done shit for you for the past 70 years, somehow magically they're going to care enough to do something all of a sudden, despite the fact that there exists zero evidence that anything is happening. Okay, so when we look at this project of the right of return from the point of view of the Palestinian living in the refugee camp, the one that's most interested in improving their conditions, I have some questions, right? I'm not confident that this makes sense. Ideologically, people are like, yes, the right of return, ultimately justice, blah, 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 blah. Okay, so if I take that and I put it aside for a second, okay, and I say, let's not start with ideology, but rather let's just start with people and their interests and be able to articulate a political goal that's meaningful and how we want to pursue it. So what we come to is like, okay, I want to pursue Lebanese citizenship. Okay, great. I think we can all agree on that. Even the people who are fully committed to the Palestine ideology can agree that we still want to give these people basic political rights. Okay? And what I hear a lot is that, Khaled, what's the problem here? There's no disagreement. We're all in the same boat. We all want this, but we also want the right of return. Well, one, I've already explained why those are two separate political projects, because the political actors involved in solving one are different than the ones solving the other. Okay? Only the Lebanese can give you citizenship, and somebody else other than the Lebanese can give you the ability to return. Unless you're basically suggesting that like, I don't know, the US invade Lebanon and force them, or like coerce the Lebanese against the popular will to embrace give Palestinians citizenship, then this is a question for the Lebanese to resolve. So, like, this is the extent of the political project. I just want to get citizenship. Everything else, let's just keep it off the books for a second. So, what are the methods that I have available to me? Like I said, it's within your locus of control. And politics is not like, another refrain that I get a lot when I say this is like, well, the Lebanese will never let this happen. You know, this is the nature of politics. Politics is not about what things are available to you right now. Nothing that we can talk about with regards to the Palestinians are choices that are available to them right now. It's about building a political project that aligns enough of the interests of people who have collectively enough power to achieve the goal. And this can happen over the course of 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, and 40 years. And you have to actually pick a political horizon, a time horizon that makes sense for the scale of the project, the scale of your demands. So those are the two things that we have. We have a goal that's logistically trivial. We don't need to do anything fancy. It's a print job. Somebody needs to press print on something, create some new passports, and hand them out to people. That's it. The politics are difficult, I admit that, okay, but they are within the locus of control of the people who are most interested in remedying their situation. It doesn't require them to hope, beg, pray that somebody else, somewhere else, who doesn't share the pressures and miseries of their life, to care about them enough to advance what is most optimal for them. Now finally, like, okay, what is the ideology that moves us forward? And here, like, I'm just going to propose something to illustrate the idea that ideology is fundamentally fluid, and we should allow ourselves, and this is quite important and incredibly controversial, we should allow ourselves to mold our ideology to maximize the utility towards the goal that we want to achieve. Okay? So how do we do this? A Palestinian person, a refugee, is saying, I want to be a Lebanese citizen. Okay? I want to have the power, the political power, and the economic power to influence the future of the Lebanese state, the future of, like, from a Lebanese person's perspective. This person is going to have the power to vote on laws that are going to affect me, affect my economic life, that of my children and my grandchildren and my great-grandchildren, the state that I value, that I identify with. What is, I believe, ideologically necessary is for the refugee to understand themselves as demanding full political and social inclusion in the Lebanese project. Not just a piece of paper, not just a technicality, not whatever. Because if I'm a Lebanese person and I want to give up a share of power, or I want to award this person the power to determine my future, that person saying, at the same time, I want all this power to determine your future, I'm also just waiting until I can go back to my true homeland, the one that I genuinely care about, the one where my blood ties me to. Those are contradictory things, right? This ideology of the right of return, or of Palestinian ethnic nationhood that bounds you to the line drawn by the fucking British, is contradictory to a demand of joining the Lebanese political project, because that's what citizenship means. Okay, it means rights and responsibilities. not admitting that there's a contradiction there or demanding that the Lebanese overlook that contradiction, okay, is also demanding that this project not move forward and not succeed. Like you're doing the hot air balloon situation. You're saying, I actually don't care whether this succeeds or not. As long as my ideological commitment is satisfied, let's just keep building hot air balloons. Okay, it doesn't matter that we're never going to get to the moon, which is fucking obvious if I'm committed to that specific ideological framework. Okay. So that's the contradiction that I guess nobody wants to admit because it's inconvenient for the ideology which they hold higher than everything else. Okay. Can we thicken up this ideology? Yeah, we can. The story of Palestinian ethnic nationhood, nationalism, this blood tie, is just a story. It's a selection of items from history woven together in order to feed a political end. The cause of the inclusion of the refugee into the Lebanese project can be built in the same way, right? You can build an ethno-nationalist framework for this thing. It's super fucking easy. Palestinians, Lebanese, Syrians, Jordanians, all these people just belong to one coherent ethnic group. It's called the Levant, Bilad al-Sham. We all speak an Arabic dialect that's completely comprehensible to one another. We eat the same food. We dance the same traditional dances. We're connected we listen to the same music. The things that connect us are incredibly, incredibly thick from a cultural perspective, not to mention insane numbers of blood ties. Okay, so that's kind of like the first little piece in building our little story. Now the second piece is that this area that holds sort of a common ethnic identity was then dissected by the French and the British in order to advance basic colonial aims. Okay, so the project of creating Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and Palestine was essentially a conspiracy of interests between the French and the British, who are trying to ensure that these states, this possible state, becomes a collection of weak statelets that isn't economically coherent enough. Like they don't have the capacity for energy production, agricultural production, access to ports, enough diversity in urban centers, like all that stuff to make it strong and be able to resist a colonial influence. And instead, what they did is they chopped it up into these little regions. And quite happily, the bourgeois of each one of these societies found it as an opportunity to claim their role as a ruling elite that fits within the mold of the colonial aims of the British and the French. Okay, so yeah, like this whole thing is false. But even if we allow it to some extent, okay, for the purposes of like my political goal and the ideological story, this like fun little story that I'm making up right now, but I'm making up purely based on facts that I'm stitching together conveniently to motivate the Palestinian refugee towards their goal, is the reality that the lines drawn by this like Sykes-Picot agreement, the agreement between the French and the British after World War I, were drawn for a couple of reasons. Roughly they were drawn along the administrative categories of maybe like the Ottoman Empire had. So there was something called Wilayat Beirut, and like that was roughly used to create the state of Lebanon. And like what Wilayat Beirut means is like the province of Lebanon. It's like, a county in the U.S. It's there primarily as an administrative unit. This is where you can have a bureaucratic formation. And what's interesting is that most of the people who ended up in Lebanon, these people who fell on the wrong side on the Palestinian side of the British, French Crayon Party, happened to belong to the province of Beirut, Wilayat Beirut. That extended all the way down to northern Akka, northern Nablus, where my family comes from, was part of that province. And it was only the desire of the British to not only divide these countries into this piece of land, this coherent piece of land, into statelets, weak statelets, with the help from the local bourgeois, but also in order to facilitate the Zionist project, did they end up drawing the lines of Palestine the way that they did. And so the point that I'm trying to make by telling the story isn't that this story is true. I'm saying that it's not untrue. Okay? And the story of Palestinian ethnic nationalhood, the story of Zionist Jewish nationhood, all these things are made up stories, these narratives. The Lebanese have their own attempts at thickening their ethnic identity, their ethno-nationalist project. They keep referring to themselves as not Canaanites, Phoenicians. This dead civilization. There's a famous Lebanese American, Nassim Taleb, who is constantly reading the genetic tea leaves of the Lebanese, searching for haplogroups that are unique to the Lebanese and somehow establish a concurrent line between the dead Phoenician civilization and the Lebanese population. And, most people outside of, these Lebanese, think that's a massive joke, because it is. So all these stories are made up. The question is, more than anything else, what story serves what purpose? It feeds into what political project? And if I'm trying to win, right? If I don't want to accommodate the religious commitments, this ideological commitment of somebody else, and I say my only optimization is trying to figure out how to resolve the problem of the Palestinian refugee intergenerationally, not just for next year, not for the year after, not for 10 years, but forever. I can't, it's been 70 years. People have lived and died, entire lifetimes have occurred in the status of deep injustice. If I'm saying I want to optimize for maximum success, I need to have all three legs of my stool be sturdy and interconnected with one another in the most robust way possible. And I should accept no compromises to that. And I need an ideological framework that supports the goal, that tells me that I am no less Lebanese than my neighbor, no matter what your interpretation is in history, and that I want to commit to a shared future with these individuals. Because anything less than that compromises my political goals. So this is essentially what I'm talking about, this basic contradiction that exists between the self-interest, of Palestinians as individuals and as groups, that all collectively share a common interest, and the project of Palestine, a political goal with an attached ideology, that, as far as I can tell, serves other political interests than maximizing the well-being of the Palestinians. So in the case of the right of return, in practice, and honestly, as an analytical framework, who does it benefit except if you're a xenophobic Lebanese piece of shit who doesn't want Palestinians to be citizens because you believe that you're Phoenician, the right of return and the ideological framework of ethno-nationalism that's drawn up, that's defined by these British-French boundaries, is super duper cool for you. This dovetailing of interests is not coincidental, right? There's a lot of people who benefit from the perpetuation of the political project of the right of return, and they have a lot of interest in perpetuating or feeding and recreating the ideological bounds, chains that keep us committed to it. Okay, so that describes one group of Palestinians, and we haven't even gotten to the meatier stuff. So let's take a look at the Palestinians in the West Bank and understand their conditions. And I'm going to go through this maybe a little bit faster. I guess before I go into this, the point that I'm trying to make, I'm not honestly trying to convince anybody of anything. It's fundamentally impossible to do that in a meaningful way. The nature of ideological commitment, like what I described in the beginning, the idea that you have to have blinders, sort of curses any group from exploring possibilities. When you make something sacred, questioning it becomes profane. Even entertaining thoughts about it becomes profane. I don't expect that Palestinians will find any of this stuff compelling. It can't. I think the thing that I'm genuinely exploring is a broader question of why things feel impossible. This is a friend of mine has a podcast called Exhaust, Emmett, and that's their tagline, why things feel impossible. It's why do things feel impossible with the Palestinians? And I'm sort of trying to explore that question. And if you're in the West Bank, at a high level, the basic things that you're suffering from aren't dramatically different than a Palestinian refugee. You lack political power in the state that controls your life. Okay, so the state of Israel is the arbiter of all things law in your life at the end of the day. If the Palestinian Authority passes a law that the Israeli government doesn't agree with, that law that gets repealed, right? The state of Israel is where you participate economically. You pay your taxes to that state, and they take those taxes and they dispense them whichever way they want, awarding them to the Palestinian Authority, which basically is just they do security and sanitation for the Israeli government in the Palestinian territories. Honestly, the most meaningful portions, I would say, of your economy, not the most meaningful, but important parts of your economy are based in the Israeli economy, day laborers going into the Israeli economy and working in that labor market, people producing goods, that usually through like Arab Israelis, the 20% of the Israeli population that happens to be originally Palestinian, buying the furniture that's made in the West Bank and then selling it into the broader Israeli market. The rest of the West Bank economy is just vaporware, or a bulk of it, right? Like a bunch of outside money that either gets sent by like European governments into the Palestinian Authority in order to hire a bunch of people, give them salaries so they can sit around in offices smoking cigarettes all day long, and to maintain an incredibly bloated series of security apparatuses that that's fundamentally there to facilitate two things. One, just to put money in people's pockets so they don't go hungry and have to become more motivated to reject the deep contradictions of their conditions, but also to sort of like the security apparatus stuff is to ensure that that's not happening anywhere else. Okay, the people who don't get salaries, who aren't beneficiaries of the largesse of European and American NGOs trying to teach Palestinians how to do entrepreneurship, or how to be more liberal in one way or another. Like the rest of the Palestinian underclass needs to be controlled using violence. So this is the nature of the Palestinian economy. It's a phantom economy. It's vaporware. So what are the political goals that the Palestinians have in the West Bank versus what are the political goals that they could have, and what are the associated ideology? Now, the political goals are sort of mixed. People want different things, I would say. But ultimately, I think what it amounts to is, there is an ambitious, progressive view that says, ultimately, we want a secular democratic state that gives everybody in the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, and Israel, make it a singular state that drops all pretense of being a Jewish national homeland, and you have a secular democratic state. So that's, I don't know the level of popularity. I think it's surprisingly popular. From the West, you would not think that it is, but I think it would be for a Westerner surprisingly popular. But equally or more popular is the idea of just establishing an independent Palestinian nation in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Okay, so something with territorial integrity, proper access to economic resources, and so on and so forth. Okay, and both of those things emerge honestly from the same ideological framework, which is the idea of ethnic nationhood over the entirety of the region defined by the British. These blood ties to this blood tie to land. And in both cases, the idea that a Jewish nationalist claim can be made over this territory without that excludes the Palestinian nationalist claim seems deeply unjust, and that needs to be corrected. And that's the one with, you have a vision of the secular democratic state, which from the point of view of the Israeli is yes, you want the destruction of Israel, right? If you define Israel as a Jewish nation, calling for just a normal secular democracy can't be understood as anything but the destruction of Israel. Okay, but like that's neither here or there. Like people are gonna feel however they want to feel about things. Right? I'm already shitting on everybody's ideological commitment, so I'm not like all of it is genuinely silly to me, or not silly. I guess the fact that people commit to it beyond the limits of its utility is unfortunate, harmful, and I don't know, upsets me a tiny bit. Okay. But let's address a couple of things. One, the idea of establishing an independent Palestinian state in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip as a political goal, driven by the idea that Palestinians are people who should have self-determination. Here you have a goal and you have an ideology that sort of matches up with that goal. So those things are coherent, I think. But the one thing that you need to interrogate for a second is like, what does that goal actually mean in terms of the lives of the Palestinians? So if I care about actually what happens to the overwhelming majority of the Palestinians, if my priority isn't the Palestinian political elite and the rich, but rather the average Palestinian, what are the consequences of establishing an independent Palestinian state? Given the fact that its economy, after 50 years of, like an Israeli project of basically denying it the ability to create an economy of self-sufficiency. And then this injection for the past 30 years of foreign aid that robbed it, honestly, of the need to produce any tools of self-sufficiency in an attempt to basically make the Palestinians completely under the control of this external economic force, therefore politically obedient. The moment all that stuff disappears, which it will, there's nothing but misery and suffering in the future of the Palestinians, in my opinion here. Like all that money goes away, all the NGO shit goes away, like nobody fucking cares anymore, because why would they? Okay? All you have is a poor state with no meaningful infrastructure for self-reproduction that's been robbed of the thing that was keeping it afloat. And in the case of separation from the Israeli labor market and the Israeli economy, this is a total fucking disaster. The emergent political entities that can exist under those conditions are not going to be nice people. Right? They're not, like, nobody's going to be promoting democracy, equality, or anything like that. It's the same fucking pieces of shit that run the prison right now. They're going to continue running it, and it's going to get worse and worse and worse, simply because of the economic devolution that is necessarily going to happen. So even though, politically, I think, politically and logistically, the goal of an independent Palestinian state seems more doable. Actually, it is, I think, more doable than some of the other options that we might explore. It's a goal, it's an optimization that purely satisfies the interest of the Palestinian bourgeois and not Palestinians as individuals. Like the vast majority of Palestinians, most of them are gonna eat shit, and they're gonna eat shit harder than they're eating shit right now. Basically, what's happening in the Gaza Strip is the destiny of everybody, in my opinion, in that future. So, yeah, even though it's easier, and like this project is completely coherent, the ideology of Palestinian self-rule and self-determination, whatever, makes sense. The goal obscures something, like it's a dishonest goal, in the sense that Palestinian self-determination just means absent any other demand, right? Like we don't say we want Palestinian self-determination under the following political economic conditions. Nobody says that. Nobody's allowed to discuss that. You say we want to get to our goal first, and then we'll discuss the other shit. Don't make any noise about the rights of individuals, their dignity, their hopes, their future, all that stuff. That's not a matter for discussion right now. Okay. So right now the entire project is optimized for creating a set of conditions where if you have existing political power, if you have money, then your conditions are going to improve, and everybody else's, as far as I can tell, will go to shit. And this will create like a new set of conditions that are going to advance in perpetuity. And there's like, whatever, you can hope and you can dream for something better, but I think it's criminal to make that bet. But it's a bet that people are willing to make because of their underlying ideological commitment. And that underlying ideological commitment, that it's better, that underlying ideological commitment is the thing that justified the Oslo Accords, right? That it's better for me, because I'm Palestinian and I have a specific ethno-nationalist commitment, that it's better that the person that comes and rules over my life, that exacts tremendous amounts of cruelty against me, that takes away my freedoms, grabs me, takes me to jail, tortures me, kicks me in the teeth and knocks them out, and then curses at me. It's better that they curse in Arabic than they curse in Hebrew. Okay? That's, in practice, what it amounts to, and this is what justified the Oslo Accords. I'll make an interesting and maybe a spicy observation, which is that before the Oslo Accords, during the 80s and the early 90s, there was sort of the existing presence of the Israeli military controlling the lives of the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, without them having political power, having curtailed economic opportunity, presented itself with political resistance. It was called the First Intifada. So the Palestinian Intifada was like popular protests, throwing rocks, and the Israeli government's response over a very long period of time was to attempt to curtail sentiments of Palestinianness. So the symbols of Palestinian statism, flags, were made illegal. Participation in Palestine identifying political parties was made illegal, right? Because the Israelis perceived that the motivator for Palestinian political dissatisfaction emerged from the contradiction between the Zionist Jewish national claims and the Palestinian ethno-nationalist claims. Okay. But in the end, and like all this attempt at suppressing Palestinian status symbols failed at controlling this uprising. And the only true success that the Israeli government had at retaining all of their influence and all of their power in every single way, but on top of that, completely neutering any resistance to their power, power that's exerted without the awarding of political influence of the people who they rule, okay, was done not by excluding or rejecting the Palestine project, but by embracing it fully. Instead of making Palestinian flags illegal, 1 million flags were made to bloom. Instead of rejecting the idea of Palestinian self-rule, you brought a cadre of Palestinian faces and you installed them as a ruling political elite. Defeating the Palestinians in this case, or their political attempts at asserting or expressing their dissatisfaction and trying to extract rights from the state that controls them, was resolved by embracing the ideological underpinnings of the Palestine project. Okay? And that gave us the Palestine Authority. Fundamentally the idea being, again, that it's better to get kicked in the teeth by somebody who swears at you in Arabic than it is that somebody who swears at you in Hebrew. This is what it comes down to. And to this day, this is the fundamental trap that I think Palestinians find themselves in the sense that despite the fact that the project isn't moving forward, the attempts at establishing a state isn't moving forward because the Palestinian Authority doesn't have the power to do that, and they never had, and they never will. The people in the West Bank, the people most interested in finding some sort of resolution, okay, and in my opinion, they're headed, like the idea of an independent state in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip is not ideal for them materially and politically, okay, but even if they desire to pursue that, they have no means of pursuing it, because the only state that can actually award them that power or award them that right is the state that actually controls their life and controls this territory, okay, the state of Israel. And the state of Israel, having successfully installed an ideologically compatible buffer between itself and the Palestinian people, has left them incapable of acting against it in a meaningful way. Because really what you want to do, like if you want to act politically, tactically, strategically, whatever, is you want to say, oh, this collection of prison guards, the Palestinian Authority, they're the ones standing between us and the state that exerts power over our lives. Okay, we would rather be under that state's authority, so nothing is mystified and obscured, and we can work directly against it through whatever political means we find useful and available to us. Okay, but we can't do that because the Palestinian Authority sits in the middle, and you have to sort of reject the basic idea that it's better to have Palestinian rule over Israeli rule in order to make the transition back into being in direct contact, in direct conflict with the state that determines your fate. Okay? So what other alternative might exist? Well, honestly, there's a state that already exists that the Palestinians pay their taxes into, in who they use its currency. It determines everything about their lives, okay, and that's the state of Israel. And because it has all this power over their lives, the idea that they don't have inherent political power in that state should be clarifying point of what a meaningful political project would be. The lowest administrative cost thing, or not the lowest, okay, it's not administratively difficult, okay, to basically change the color of the passport of the Palestinians from whatever garbage nonsense they get from the Palestinian Authority, this sanitation organization, to an Israeli one. Right. Again, it's just a print job. So logistically, it's not that difficult. Politically, it's very difficult, very, very difficult, much more difficult than establishing an independent, soon-to-fail Palestinian state in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. But that project clarifies what the steps are that you need to perform and takes you from a position of complete impotence, not being able to do anything, not being able to do anything coherent, to saying, yes, we necessarily have to dispose of the Palestinian Authority, this mystifying, obscuring force. We have to demand our citizenship from the Israeli state, and so on and so forth. You might ask, okay, so those are the two legs of the stool. What about the third one? What is the ideological framework? Obviously this, implied in this is a rejection of Palestine as a pursuit, Palestinian statehood as a pursuit, or even the idea of the negation of the Zionist framework as a precondition to inclusion of the Palestinians in the Israeli state. I'm just saying, advance a goal of just reaching parity with every other Israeli citizen in terms of the normal political rights that they all share. Okay, like I said, 20% of the Israeli citizens happen to be Palestinian Arabs. So basically, have the shared status. A lot of people immediately complain about racism, economic injustice, la 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 la. Those are political problems, yes. And like I said, the problem of politics isn't taking what you have right now, but rather, and choosing from it, right? But articulating what you want in the long term and finding the tools necessary in order to advance to that goal. And if you want a future where Palestinians live in economic dignity, have full political rights, have escape from social oppression and violence, okay, inclusion in the Israeli state as full political citizens, okay, is a step in that direction. You don't have less power over what the Israeli state does and doesn't do if you are a citizen. Because right now you have zero power, okay? Becoming a citizen, having the right to vote, however suboptimal because of a million different reasons having to do with the nature of Israeli politics, is infinitely better than the situation that you're in right now. And if you have any sense of a political project that extends beyond the front of your nose, anything that beyond what I want tomorrow, which is ideal perfection, and says, okay, what is my 20-year program? What are my maximal ambitions for the Palestinians? Then articulating a rational series of steps within which Palestinians becoming Israeli citizens is obviously a sensible program. And some people are like, oh, I see what you're doing here. Okay, you're playing 3D chess with Zionism, right? Ultimately what you're trying to do is you bring in enough Palestinians, you give them citizenship, And because of the balance of political power and who gets to vote, whatever the numbers, eventually you get to overthrow Zionism. And like, I'm not playing 3D chess, okay? Because for this to work, you have to have a motivating ideological framework that isn't, I'm doing the same thing I've always done for the same reason I've always done, but now I'm gonna wink at you and pretend like I'm doing something else. Like, it doesn't work. The problem with the existing ideological framework is that it legitimates the underlying framework of both Zionism and Palestinian ethno-nationalism. Okay. I don't want to play this game. I don't want to play chess or checkers or whatever. There has to be a completely different thing, a completely different paradigm that's going to make this thing work, because this paradigm doesn't. You can't think that you're playing 3D chess and have this succeed. So you have to build another ideological framework. You know, and again, this is a fluid exercise, and something that like emerges organically. It doesn't happen like the way that I'm doing it, or like, oh, the story of the Levant and you know, Wilayat Beirut and these people belong and blood, whatever, all this stuff. Like, it doesn't happen with one person making something up. But like, the reason I present these options is just to understand the fluidity that we can find within the universe of options. If we're operating a time horizon that extends beyond sort of the front of our nose, and we say, okay, like, what do I desire for people in, you know, 30 to 40 years? And what's a commensurate politics? And then I say, like, my ambitions for the Palestinians, because I don't know whether I like it or not, I have a sense of kinship towards them, isn't just that they call themselves citizens of Palestine. Like, that's not good enough as far as I'm concerned. If that's all you're trying to achieve, okay, fuck you. I think they deserve more, and I want them to have more. So I can imagine that an ideology, a political formation, or like an ideological framework that says, that maybe embraces like a materialist, a historic materialist understanding of people's conditions, the relations of power, as being basically rooted in who controls what, and because of that, who gets to exploit who. There are these phenomenon, these emergent phenomena of classes who end up bound in shared interests, or the emergence of the class itself emerges from the existence of this shared interest. And you could be on one side of the equation or the other. And if you're on one side, if you can conceive of yourself as, for example, a worker, and you can get other people to conceive of themselves as a worker, and you don't do it by like convincing them or talking them through it, I think that's a silly way of thinking about the problem. But anyways, we're going to talk about it this way nonetheless. Then what you present to yourself is an opportunity to align the interests of everybody involved here, okay, against like the vast majority of people in this, what you hope is going to be a state of all its people, under a polarization that pits them against those in power, against the bourgeois, on whatever that bourgeois, whatever face, whatever language they happen to have. Okay, so that's like an ideological framework that you can build and you can advance as part of something that says, I want to be an Israeli citizen because the Israeli government exercises power over me and I participate in its economy, and I want to align all our collective interests, the Israeli citizens, whatever they may be, the 20% who happen to be Muslim and Christian or Druze, the rest that happen to be Jewish, whether religious or secular, right? Like all these people, if I can describe an ideological framework that puts us all together, and find ways of mobilizing that ideology through institutions or organizations, then I have a way in that moves me forward. Obviously, this ideology is in deep contradiction with the ideology of Palestine. Okay, one that claims ethnic nationhood, ones that clarify the lines of the friend-enemy distinction as being between those who claim Jewish nationhood over a made-up place, or Palestinian nationhood over a made-up place, right? That's the dividing line there. So you have to sort of change the state of play if your ambitions are different. And maybe like what I just described is a really stupid ideology. Maybe it's even a bad goal. Right? I don't know. Right? The greater point that I'm making is that as long as I insist that ideology comes first, this thing that I feel deep in my bones, the thing that like even me, as I'm sitting here challenging it, like I have a sense of being like alienated from myself because it's so deeply embedded. And I'm sure it's like 1,000 times worse, like in terms of my alienation towards like a relative to somebody who's like Palestinian. If I'm not willing to sort of suspend that commitment for a second, understand where this ideology actually comes from, right? This is not like, even though ideology needs to feel like it's truth and nature and whatever for it to work as blinders, okay, the reality is it has a story, it has a narrative, it has an origin, and it feeds a set of interests. And right now, okay, given the fact that we've been in a status quo for an extended period of time, a status quo of deep misery and suffering for the Palestinians, you know, like when this stuff happens in the Gaza Strip every 6 to 8 years, like it's not a singular event. Like when the Israelis go in and bomb and kill and destroy the infrastructure, and then the Palestinians spend, nearly a decade trying to rebuild their lives. We're not talking about a thing, we're talking about a cycle. A set of conditions, a balance of power that necessitates the recreation of the cycle over and over and over. And if you only concern yourself with the instance and how bad the instance is, as opposed to asking the question, how do I fundamentally change the balance of power here so that the occurrence of this thing is no longer necessary, okay, you're not asking the right questions. You're not recognizing the cyclical nature of the thing, the chronic nature of it. We have to say, okay, let's put the ideology on hold a little bit. Actually be willing to critique it a little bit by understanding who it benefits and who it doesn't benefit. By looking at what goals it recommends and what methods it recommends, right? If it recommends impetus, then it benefits those who are happy within the status quo. So the Palestinian Authority, having an ideology that recommends impetus, okay, benefits. So they are heavily invested in the promotion, the recreation of the ideology of Palestine. Like to clue you into this, the nature of this thing, it's like before 1968, this thing that we all feel in our bones, its nature, its contours. It feels like it's just fact of time immemorial, right? Was something that's fluid and was up for debate amongst Palestinians, right? There's Pan-Arabism, there was the Socialist Syrian Nationalist Party, right? Our self-conception of where we wanted to go and what's good for us was, from an ideological point of view, was up for debate. It was only after like the 1967 war, the defeat essentially of, or the delegitimization in people's eyes of the Pan-Arab narrative, that this little, the PLO and the scumbag leadership of the PLO, people who desperately wanted to establish a statist framework for who they were, right? They wanted to claim authority, maximal authority. And that was their primary objective, and always has been, right? The way they operated in Jordan, Lebanon, right? This attempts to create states within states, their desperation for international recognition, having states recognize them as the primary authority that represents the Palestinians, having a seat at the UN, like all this stuff, okay? And the way that they went about transacting it, which is like the institution of state apparatuses, offices, salaries, and so on and so forth. Like the PLO, their desires, their objectives, the need to create a singular nationalist entity where all the Palestinians everywhere, their money would go to support the Palestinian cause, would become synonymous of going into the pockets of the PLO, okay? That's where the ideology, that's how the ideology got hardened within the outlines that it got hardened in. The thing that we believe is natural, right? It's not to say that people don't have attachment to their homeland. They do, it's just normal, okay? But the reality is people 3 generations in refugee camps, live in a project of no political options and are embedded within a framework of ideological formation that they can't escape from. And that's due to the fact that there are plenty of interested Palestinian parties, okay, who don't share the interests of those refugees, or the people, the common person living in the West Bank, or the common person living in Gaza Strip. You know, again, if you're a Palestinian living in the US, you know, you're doing good, you are not compelled to question an ideological project that fills you with meaning and purpose, solidifies your social bonds with other Palestinians who live here in the US, gives you something to do when you get to college, you know, a club to join, right? Gives you a sense of identity. Like, what do you say when people ask you, where are you from? If there is no ideological framework, what do? It creates a hole, like an ethnic nationalist hole in your soul that you can't deal with leaving wide open. It doesn't matter what the costs are, because you don't bear the costs, the political costs of insisting that this is the only ideological framework from which we can operate. And by the nature of your position, and there are, again, more Palestinians living outside of the conditions that I described, in the West Bank, in the refugee camps, and in the Gaza Strip. There are more Palestinians living outside of those conditions than within those conditions. They get to dictate a lot of the terms. They have outsized influence in the same way that the Palestinian elites, the political elites in the West Bank, the PLO, Hamas in the Gaza Strip have outsized influence in determining like what is ideologically acceptable, what can be said and what can't be said. You know, Palestinians here in the U.S., you know, you visit the West Bank, you spend some money, you build a house there. You're interested in a future Palestinian state. The fact that you have outsized power means that you have the potential to be part of an elite there. And you don't want that to be part of a solution that's part of an Israeli state. Like, you don't care about that. It doesn't fit your ideological preferences, and you don't need to modify anything. You're already doing good. So why give that up? Anyways, so this is why nothing feels possible. We're all stuck. The legs of the stool are the ones that we have right now are incredibly stable, but they have nothing to do with an optimal advancement of the interests of people. They have to do primarily with the advancement of the interests of the bourgeois, whether it be the Lebanese ruling elite, the Palestinian ruling elite, and honestly, like the Israeli ruling elite. Like I said, the success of ending political opposition during the Intifada was predicated not on a rejection of Palestinian ethno-nationalist ideology, but a full embrace of it. This is how you maintain stability right now, and you know, the fact that you need a different ideology and a different political objective in order to mobilize people towards political action is not what anybody in power wants. Okay, impotence is the preferred mode of operation. Anyways, this has been a lot of talking, a lot. I doubt anybody's stuck around, but if you have, thank you for indulging me. And I guess good night.